Is Mayim Acharonim, washing one's hands before Birkat HaMazon, obligatory?
There is no doubt that Mayim Acharonim, after a meal before Birkat HaMazon, is a Hova. And there are many reasons for saying so, many sources. We will mention here just a few. The first thing to mention in this regard is the fact that Mayim Acharonim, far from being a minhag, some custom or practice, but as opposed to something obligatory, something that was clearly stipulated by Hazal, the first proof of this fact is to be found in the Mishnah. Mayim Acharonim is mentioned in the Mishnah. In Masechet Berachot, Perek Shemini, the 8th chapter, Halacha Gimel, we learn as follows: Beth Shammai Omerim, Mechabadim et habayit, that after eating a meal, we are to clean up the area where the meal was eaten. If it's a table, then the table has to be, all the remains, all the debris, the peels, the bones, the crumbs, etc. from the meal have to be removed from the table. If, as it was in those days, in the time of the Mishnah, a meal was eaten sitting on the floor or on some kind of a special couch designed for reclining at a meal, and the area of the house, the floor had to be swept, etc. That's what the words mechabadim et habayit means. It refers to sweeping the floor and cleaning the area where the meal was eaten. This has to be done first, according to Beth Shammai, at the end of the meal, and only afterwards, ahar kach notalim layadayim. In other words, first the area has to be cleaned and swept and made presentable and fitting for the great, very important mitzvah of Birkat HaMazon that we are about to perform, and then we wash our hands immediately before Birkat HaMazon. Beth Hillel disagree, but not about the need for Mayim Acharonim. They simply say, Beth Hillel omerim notalim layadayim, they reverse the order, and in fact the correct interpretation of this Mishnah is that it is possible to first wash your hands in preparation for Birkat HaMazon, and then to remove the debris, the crumbs, the bones, the peels, etc. from the table or from the floor or wherever it was that the meal was eaten. In other words, the difference between Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel is only with regards to the order. But Mayim Acharonim is mentioned in the Mishnah, both by Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel, and it is clear that it is an absolute requirement. That is number one. The second essential source with regards to this question is to be found in the same chapter at the end of Perek Shemini of Masechet Berachot in the Talmud Bavli, at the very end, and this is on Daf Nun Gimel. And there it states as follows, based on the pasuk in Sefer Vayikra, Perek Kaf, chapter 20. The pasuk there states, "V'hit kadishtem v'hitem kedoshim," that you shall sanctify yourselves, you shall make an effort, you shall do certain things in order to make yourselves holy. V'hitem kedoshim, and in fact you shall be therefore holy. Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am Hashem your God. And this pasuk is quoted by a Baraita mentioned at the end of this chapter in Masechet Berachot. It says as follows: Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. The statement was made in the name of Rav, the famous Amora, the first generation of Amoraim, a Talmid of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and was also quoted in the name of a Baraita. V'hit kadishtem elu mayim rishonim. This term, V'hit kadishtem, is seen as a hint to the concept, which is midrabanan, which is divrei sofarim, not min haTorah, which is mayim rishonim, the washing of the hands before a meal, before eating bread. V'hitem kedoshim elu mayim acharonim, and the second word in the pasuk, V'hitem kedoshim, and you shall be holy, you shall be special, pure, and prepare yourselves and achieve therefore a level of kedusha. This is seen as a hint referring to the concept of Mayim Acharonim, washing the hands after the meal, so that our hands are clean, as a kind of preparation for Birkat HaMazon. So from that source, from that Baraitha and that statement of Rav, we see that just as Mayim Rishonim were enacted by the Chachamim for various reasons, which we will not go into today, because our topic today is Mayim Acharonim, and everyone knows that Mayim Rishonim is a Hova, is something that we are required to do. It is not a question of custom, and it's not up to a person to choose and decide if he wishes to do so or not. Similarly, Mayim Acharonim was learnt from, as a kind of remez, asmachta, from the same pasuk, from the next word in the pasuk, V'yitem kedoshim. This refers to Mayim Acharonim. So in terms of the importance and the obligation regarding these two types of netilah, of these two washings of the hands, they are to be seen and to be understood on more or less the same level. The third source that we need to mention here is to be found in Masechet Hulin, Daf Kof He. There in Masechet Hulin, it states, Amar Rav Yehuda bar Rav Hiya, Mipnei ma amru. What was the reason that the Chachamim stated Mayim Acharonim Hova, that Mayim Acharonim is a Hova? You see that they stress that Mayim Acharonim is a Hova, and it goes on to say, Mipnei she'adam ochel ahar sudato melah, because it is normally the case that a person eats during and after the meal, eats salt as part of the meal, salt is used. V'yesh ba melah sedomith. There was a kind of salt that was either common or certainly in existence at that time, which was known as melach sedomith, shemesamet ha'inayn, which could cause blindness. In other words, if a person touched their eyes, as Rashi explains, if a person touched their eyes during the meal, after the meal, after having touched their salt, and perhaps the salt also had within it some melach sedomith, which was a kind of salt somehow connected to the area of Sodom, near the Dead Sea, and this kind of salt was known to contain a substance which could cause great injury, perhaps even blindness to the eyes. Therefore, it constitutes a danger to one's health, a serious danger. Losing one's sight, after all, is a very serious thing. And for this reason, the Gemara states in Masechet Hulin that Mayim Acharonim is a Hova. So we have these three sources, the Mishnah and Berachot, the Baraitha and statement by Rav in Masechet Berachot, which shows clearly that Mayim Acharonim, like Mayim Rishonim, are a Hova, and were enacted by the Chachamim as an act of Kedusha and Tahara and Nikiyuth, in other words, acts of bringing upon ourselves and causing ourselves to act in a certain way, to prepare for a certain thing that we're about to do. In the case of Mayim Rishonim, we're preparing ourselves for the meal. This is the idea that a meal is not something that one just eats and swallows and stuffs down in order to sate one's hunger, but rather that a meal is itself a kind of Avodat Hashem, particularly when it is done on the basis of a certain awareness and understanding of our connection to the world in which we live and to the blessings that Hashem bestows upon us. And similarly with Mayim Acharonim is a preparation and a way of putting ourselves in the right frame of mind before performing the very, very important and fundamental mitzvah of Birkat HaMazon, which is, after all, the only bracha which is explicitly mentioned in the Torah. In the Torah it says explicitly, "V'achalta v'sav'ata," you shall eat and be satisfied, "Uverachta et Adonai Elohecha," and you shall bless and thank Hashem, your God. Birkat HaMazon is based on that pasuk. It is the only bracha that we recite that is clearly based on a pasuk in the Torah. It is therefore a very important bracha for that reason, and also for other reasons, because Birkat HaMazon, as we say it, includes within it very deliberately, this is how Hazal chose to formulate Birkat HaMazon. They very deliberately included within Birkat HaMazon all the essential beliefs and concepts of the Torah, essentially. When one recites Birkat HaMazon, one is, as it were, summing up, and it is an act of reminding oneself of the essentials of the Torah, of Judaism, of what it is to be a Jew, what are the things that are important to us, what it is that connects us to Hashem, and what are those things to which we aspire as individuals and as a nation. That is why we mention leaving Egypt. That is why we mention receiving the gift of Eretz Yisrael, the gift of receiving the Torah. This is why we speak about the building of Yerushalayim and the Mikdash, the temple, etc., etc. Birkat HaMazon is a very important act, miswa of Avodat Hashem. And just as with other important miswot, as we will presently see, such as reading Kriyat Shema twice a day, or tefillah, which is to say Shmona Esrei, which is something also we do a number of times a day. Before each one of these miswot, we are required to do Netilat Yadayim, as we will presently learn and mention. The same is true, and even more true perhaps in some ways, of Birkat HaMazon. If it is necessary to wash one's hands, for example, before reciting the tefillah, the Shmona Esrei, which is not min HaTorah, how much more so is it obvious that we must prepare ourselves and act in a manner which indicates that we are aware and we are internalizing the fact that we are about to commune with Hashem by way of Birkat HaMazon, which is a mitzvah mentioned in the Torah. How much more obvious is it that we have to wash our hands as preparation for performing this very wonderful and beautiful mitzvah of Birkat HaMazon. And all this becomes very clear when we look at the Rambam in Ilchot Berachot Perek Shishi. Rambam begins the chapter by saying, Kol ha'ochel hapath shemevarachim aleh hamosi, a person who wishes to eat bread, the kind of bread on which one has to say the bracha of hamosi lahem min ha'aretz, sarich netilat yadayim tahila wasof. One has to wash one's hands before eating that bread and after eating that bread as a preparation for Birkat HaMazon. So says Rambam, and he goes on to say in the next halacha, Kol hanotel yadav, a person who washes their hands, ben la'achila, whether it is for eating bread, as we just mentioned, ben lekriyat Shema, whether it is before reciting the Shema, ben letfila, or davening Shmona Esrei, if one is davening tefillah without Shema preceding it, such as, shall we say, Tefilat Minha, before every tefillah, before every Kriyat Shema, if it is separate from the tefillah, and before eating bread, says Rambam, one has to wash one's hands, and one has to say the bracha, Asher Kiddushan Miswatho Wasiwanu Al Natilat Yadayim. With regards to Mayim Acharonim, Rambam states that a bracha is not to be said. This is actually something which the Rishonim disagree about, and this is a point which we can take up on another occasion. But Rambam clearly states that one has to wash one's hands before eating the bread and also after eating, before Birkat HaMazon. Later in Halacha, well, Rambam continues and says, Kol hanotel yadao, sarich lizaher ba'al ba'ad devarim. When washing one's hands, one has to take note of four things, says Rambam. The Mayim Asmam, the water itself, Shelo yu pesulim natilat yadayim. It has to be water which is proper and ra'ui for natilat yadayim. Water, for example, that was used to wash something else previously, or to do some other form of work, or to perform some other task. Such water cannot be used, for example, for natilat yadayim. The Rambam continues, the shi'ur, sheyeh bahem revi'ith lechol shtei yadayim. There has to be one revi'ith, about 80 cc of water, at least that much, for two hands, the two hands of one person. And one has to use a kli, a vessel, Shiyu hamayim shenotarim bahem bechli. The water has to be in a vessel and has to be poured from that vessel onto the person's hands. These are the four things that Rambam mentions, and this applies, according to Rambam, clearly to all the netiloth, all the washings of hands that were referred to earlier in this chapter, namely whether one is washing one's hands before eating bread, or before reciting Kriyat Shema, or before Tefillah. All these halachot and all these rules apply equally. And later in Halachat Teth, Rambam mentions certain differences that exist between Mayim Rishonim and Mayim Acharonim. For example, with regards to Mayim Acharonim, one should not use very hot water, because if the water is very hot, it tends to soften the skin, and therefore the grease that may be on one's hands after having eaten greasy foods, for example, will tend to be absorbed more by the skin rather than being washed off the skin. And Rambam brings a couple of examples of differences between Mayim Rishonim and Mayim Acharonim. But apart from those differences, the clear indication is that there are no other distinctions between Mayim Rishonim and Mayim Acharonim. They are both equally a chovah, and they both need to be from a kli, from a vessel, as we said. And all the rules that apply to one apply to the other, except for these very specific things that Rambam mentions in Halachat Teth. And this point is also stressed by the Riaz, Rabbeinu Yishaya HaAharon, the grandson of Rabbeinu Yishaya Rishon, the Reed. He writes as follows, at the end of the 8th chapter of Berachot: Nir'eh be'inai she'en halukim mayim rishonim mimayim aharonim ela bidvarim halalu shekatavnu. The only differences between the two are those that we have just mentioned, because earlier he mentioned the difference between, for example, the temperature of the water that can be used with reference to Mayim Rishonim as opposed to Mayim Acharonim, and certain other facts or details mentioned there. But apart from these things, says the Riaz, there is no other difference. They have to both be with water that is kasher l'ntilat yadayim, that was not used for other purposes, for example, as we mentioned. It cannot be water from the hot springs in a place like Tiberia, for example. That cannot be used for Mayim Rishonim. And there has to be also Mikoach Adam, it has to be poured onto one's hands. So we see from all of these things that the rules and the halachot that apply to Mayim Rishonim apply also to Mayim Acharonim. Now to return to the three sources that we mentioned at the outset. The Mishnah in Masechet Berachot, which speaks about cleaning and sweeping the area where the meal was eaten as a preparation for the bracha that is about to be recited, Birkat HaMazon, and also together with that the Mayim Acharonim, the washing of the hands, as another preparation for that bracha. We mentioned the Gemara in Masechet Berachot, which speaks about Mayim Rishonim and Mayim Acharonim in the same breath, both based, learnt from and connected to the same pasuk in Sefer Vayikra, which speaks about Kedusha and the need for the Jewish people to act in a certain way in order to achieve a certain awareness, a certain consciousness, to connect to Hashem, to relate to the things that we do, such as partake of a meal, to see them in the correct light, in the proper way, and not just as a animalistic, physical need to deal with the fact that one is hungry. This is true before eating the meal, and it is equally true after eating the meal. Both of these acts of Mayim Rishonim and Mayim Acharonim provide some kind of a framework, as it were, for the meal itself. It places the meal in between these two netilot, between these two washings of the hands, so that everything that we do in the meal is part of this v'hitkadishtem v'hitem kedoshim, part of this this attempt and this requirement to act in a certain way, to be people with spiritual awareness, and to connect ourselves to Hashem in all the things that we do, even on a daily basis. We also mentioned the Gemara Masechet Holin, which gives us a separate, further reason for Mayim Acharonim, and that is the possibility that a person may have partaken of a certain kind of salt during the meal, which was apparently known in those days. I'm not familiar with such a type of salt today. I've never heard of such a thing nowadays, but apparently there was such a salt that was known, that contained a material which could cause serious injury to the eyes, perhaps even blindness, and therefore we are told, as a matter of sakana, of preventing a possible injury, we are told we need to wash our hands after eating a meal. The question is how to put together these different sources, and this is often the question which presents itself to us when we learn halakha bi'iyun in depth. Some Rishonim saw the reason mentioned in Masechet Holin as the essential reason. In other words, the real reason, according to those Rishonim, for Mayim Acharonim is the Melach Sodom. The reason for Mayim Acharonim is Melach Sodomith. The possibility that a person will cause injury to his eyes. It therefore follows, according to some Rishonim, that if Melach Sodomith is something that we no longer have, we are not familiar with such a thing, we do not come into contact with such a substance, therefore it should no longer be necessary. This is the view of the Tosafot in both of those places, in Barachot and in Holin. They suggest that as a result of the fact, as a consequence of the fact that Melach Sodomith is no longer with us, therefore Mayim Acharonim is no longer a necessity. Even those opinions, even the Tosafot in these two places, stress that another consideration, namely washing one's hands as a preparation for the bracha, is still a consideration, particularly for those who would normally wash their hands anyhow. In other words, having eaten a meal where one touched different greasy substances, etc., one's hands become somewhat soiled as a result. A person who would, in the normal course of events, wash their hands is required to wash their hands also before Birkat HaMazon, even though they mention that nowadays, this was the case apparently when these words were written in medieval Europe, even though nowadays we are not particularly fastidious about washing our hands after every meal. But someone who is, stress the Tosafot, must wash their hands before Birkat HaMazon. But they did see the concept of the sakana because of Melach Sodom. They saw in this the essential reason for Mayim Acharonim. As opposed to that view, other Rishonim, such as the Rosh and the Rabbeinu Yonah and others, explain quite the reverse. They say the essential reason is Mishum Kedusha and Tahara and Nikiyuth. In other words, as we explained, as a preparation for Birkat HaMazon, so that we prepare ourselves, and one of those forms of preparation is Netilat Yadayim, just as we wash our hands before reading the Shema or before Tefillah, so we must do before Birkat HaMazon. And a further reason, which served to bring home the absolute need to be very pedantic about Mayim Acharonim, was the further reason of Melach Sodom, the Hashash, the possibility that it could cause injury to one's eyes if one did not do so. To quote the Rosh at the end of the 8th chapter of Masechet Barachot, he says, the essential reason for Mayim Acharonim is Mishum Kedusha, Omeru Shehem Niswa. That is why we are told that we must do Mayim Acharonim in the first place, as we explained. Umishum Sakanat Melach Sodomit Hosifu La'asotha Hova. And because of the extra dimension, the extra further consideration of Melach Sodomith, of causing damage to one's eyes, they stress further that there is another reason to do so, to be very careful with regards to this mitzvah of Mayim Acharonim. So there is in fact no contradiction between these two sources. The essential reason, according to the Rosh, and so writes Rabbeinu Yonah, is the preparation for Birkat HaMazon, the Kedusha aspect of it. And Hazal also mentioned another further reason, perhaps also in order to encourage people, perhaps even to scare people into doing so. Perhaps, for example, they saw that some people were not very careful and not very concerned with performing the miswah of Mayim Acharonim, and the extra consideration of the possible injury to one's eyes served to encourage people and to even put the fear of the Lord into them, so to speak, so that they should in fact do this miswah of Mayim Acharonim. That, I believe, is the correct understanding of this miswah of Mayim Acharonim, that the essential reason is a preparation for Birkat HaMazon, which is a hovah in and of itself, and on top of that there was also a medical, physical reason connected to possible injury to the eyes, but this was not the essential main reason for the miswah. So writes the Rosh, the Rabbeinu Yonah, and many other Rishonim. The Gra was also, the Gaon of Vilna was also of this view. We find in Ma'aseh Rav, in Oth Pei Daled, he writes that Mayim Acharonim are hovah and a miswah, like Mayim Rishonim, kamo Mayim Rishonim, so it says here. And therefore one has to use not less than a revi'ith of water, as we said, about 80 cc of water. And also one has to use a vessel, betoch kli, so says the Gra. And this fits exactly what we said before when we read from the Rambam and also from the Riaz, that these two miswoth, Mayim Rishonim and Mayim Acharonim, are to be performed in exactly the same way, with the exception of particular details that were singled out by Chazal. And this is also what we find in the Tur and in the Shulchan Aruch. Both the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch stress in Siman Kof Pei Aleph that Mayim Acharonim Hova, that is in fact the first seif, the first clause of this Siman in the Shulchan Aruch consists of 3 words, Mayim Acharonim Hova, this is a requirement. And the Mishnah Brura goes on to explain these 2 reasons for Mayim Acharonim, and he stresses even when Melach Sodomit is not common, nevertheless the other reason applies. And the same thing we find at the end of this Siman. In Siman Yod, the Shulchan Aruch mentions that there are those who have the minhag of not doing Mayim Acharonim, and there he also mentions that those who are more concerned with their personal hygiene, people who wash their hands more frequently, and I think it's clear that today we are all in such a position. Compared to medieval Europe, we are all particularly hygienic, and we have water in constant supply of water. We don't have to walk down the road with the bucket to the well to draw water for the house, so perhaps they were more circumspect in how they used water and what they used water for. Today we have taps, we turn on the tap and we have water on demand, and we are also much more used to washing our hands more frequently, and therefore the Shulchan Aruch says the person who is used to washing their hands after a meal is certainly required to do so. And the Mishnah Brura also stresses this point. He writes, mentions the Gra, and he also mentions the Magen Avraham and the Maharshal and the Birkei Yosef, all stating that Mayim Acharonim is something that one must be very fastidious and religious, so to speak, about performing, and not being slack or regarding this miswah and not treating it lightly, because it is in fact a very important part of the miswah of Birkat HaMazon, which, as we said before, is a very central and very meaningful miswah when it is done properly and correctly.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button, which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.